Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. After the Queen's death, it was not unexpected that you have swaths of the Canadian media trying to talk up the Republican option, meaning what do we do about the future of the monarchy in this country? But a lot of those conversations have been either in bad faith or missing crucial context, like the fact that this requires major constitutional change. And so I figured I would take a few minutes and just think through some of what it is exactly that we're asking when it comes to this particular question. And the first thing is the fact that it's often being described in incorrect terms. A lot of it is being described as the British monarchy. You know, there's poll questions about should Canada cut ties with the British monarchy? And the thing is that it hasn't been the British monarchy in Canada since 1931. After the Statute of Westminster, the Crown of Canada was created. It became the Canadian Monarchy, and it operates separately and distinctly from the UK monarchy, and the royal family operates also differently in Canada. The way in which royals interact in the Canadian context is vastly different from how they do in the British context. And most people don't necessarily understand that distinction, but it is one that is there and is a real thing. And it's something that we need to keep in mind when it is that, you know, what we're asking to be changing. This notion that somehow it's still colonial and that, you know, it feels like we're living in our parents' basement is one of the things I keep hearing. Doesn't really apply because we have a different relationship than we used to pre-1931 and certainly post-1982. So those are things we need to kind of keep in mind when we start thinking through what it is that is being asked in this Republican option. So one of the first things is how do we expect this Republican option to present itself? How are we going to find someone who can act as the kind of head of state function for the country? And what I mean here is what kind of president exactly are we looking for? And this is an important question because this is what killed the Republican movement in Australia. When they had their referendum, the option on the table was for the government to appoint someone to the role, and this quickly became accusations that the government was trying for a power grab, and the referendum failed, and support for the monarchy in Australia has been on the increase ever since. And this is one of the things we don't, you know, when the Republican movement starts talking about we want to get rid of the monarchy, well, they don't really say what they want to replace it with, and that's a really important question. We in Canada are so used to the American presidential system that I think it would be hard to escape the notion that we would want a president with some kind of similar powers, even though it doesn't mesh with our constitutional reality. At the same time, people will point to somewhere like Ireland, where their president is very much acts like a governor general, does in Canada. They're nonpartisan, they do the ceremonial stuff, and so on. But Ireland is not Canada. They are a fairly homogenous society in terms of culture. They do have two official languages there, but it's the same kind of culture that speaks both, as well as the fact that they're the size of a postage stamp. So the logistics of having a countrywide election for a nonpartisan candidate are very different from how that would play out in Canada. If we decided we wanted this kind of particular model of presidency where our parliamentary system would largely remain intact, the difficulty is that we're a very big country, and it is very expensive to run an election and to run a campaign in a country like this. And this is why I don't think it would last very long as a nonpartisan option, because the candidates for this office would wind up needing to fall back on established networks for fundraising and voter identification and so on, and that's the political parties. So I have a strong suspicion that even if they don't officially identify with an existing political party, they would still be using their networks and volunteer base and so on. And I think it would be, partisan in all but name if that was the actual case. It's also important to remember that we did try in pre-Confederation history a partially elected Senate, and one of the reasons why they ended that at the point of Confederation was to run a province-wide election for those Senate seats had already become prohibitively expensive in 1867 terms. Try and multiply that in 2022 terms across the entire country and run one of those campaigns. I don't think that's been thought through very well in that regard. As well, it's the unifying aspect, which I think is one that gets really overlooked, because how are you going to find candidates that can play to our linguistic duality and our cultural, not duality, but multiplicity in this country? Finding someone who can satisfy both Quebec and the West is going to be exceedingly difficult, and I strongly suspect that it would simply create more divisions and create bigger problems than exist currently under our constitutional monarchy. And this doesn't get discussed. It's just simply this notion that monarchy equals bad without necessarily under discussion about what they want to replace it with, which I think is one of the considerations that we're not really being aware of when people are having this particular conversation. It also goes to what kind of powers we want this elected president to have. Do we want them to remain ceremonial, kind of like a governor general, or do we want them to have some additional powers on top of that? Would having an elected mandate make them have an effective veto at the point of royal assent for a bill, or whatever we would call it, at that point? And this is where the partisan aspect starts to come in. And this is where you will find a point of friction, particularly if this does not become a necessarily non-partisan particular office. As well, they would want to have some kind of mandate that they would run on. If it's not a legislative mandate, then it would have to be, I want to be the education president, I want to be the volunteerism president, and that requires a lot more time and resources than currently governors general have with Rideau Hall, where they do have some level of initiatives that they want to pursue in their time, but they do it in a much more soft power capacity. And when you have someone who has elected office, that gives them the kind of weight or legitimacy for hard power. And how that rubs up against the parliamentary system is going to be a really interesting point of friction, which again, nobody is necessarily talking about. As well, one of the other things that never gets discussed, or almost never, is what this does for our treaty relationship with First Nations. these treaties, where they exist, have been signed with the crown, and they're done in a capacity with ceremony and with a kind of personal relationship in mind. And replacing one of the treaty partners is going to be extremely difficult. People are saying, well, it's illegal. It's legally easy to have a successor state take over those treaties, and essentially that's what happened post 1982, really post 1931, but 82 especially because of Section 35 in the 1982 Constitution. But really, there is a relationship there with those communities, with those nations, and that's not something that can be just glossed over if we replace the crown with the president. And that is something that is really not being necessarily understood. There's a lot of talk about the colonial narrative around that, but again, I think there's a lot of nuance. There's huge amounts of nuance in there that isn't really being teased out, and I think that discussion needs to happen, and it's not really happening with the kind of really surface level Republican conversation that's happening or not really happening in this country. And again, that's something that needs to really be thought through in terms of what the implications of this notion are. The next big thing is, of course, constitutional change. It's not a simple search and replace crown with president in our Constitution, because the crown is the central organizing principle of the entire framework. So removing that means essentially an entire wholesale rewrite of the document, the Constitution, the structure by which it exists. And that's not going to be an easy task. And constitutional change in this country is difficult, and it is now existential because of the way in which Quebec has largely flexed its muscles around constitutional change. And in more recent times, and if Quebec has demands, then Alberta is also going to make sure that it has demands, and Saskatchewan's going to follow what Alberta does, and so on and so on. And it becomes Pandora's box. And if you're going to have a wholesale rewrite of the Constitution, necessary if you're going to remove the crown, that's going to be a nigh impossible task. It's going to possibly destroy the country, and that's not even being hyperbolic. I mean, the country was nearly torn apart in the 1990s after the Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords. It went really, really badly. And do we want to put ourselves through that again to fix something that isn't broken? And that's kind of the final point I have here, is what exactly is the reason for this change, other than a few people are, I don't know, jealous or perhaps not fully understanding or appreciating what constitutional monarchy has done for us. And I think that's kind of the final point, is what is broken that we're trying to fix? And I don't know that anything is necessarily broken. We've got a system that works exceedingly well. And you may disagree with inherited monarchy, but we can change who the monarch is. Yes, that would also require constitutional change, but of a somewhat lesser extent than the wholesale rewrite that would be required to remove the monarchy entirely. So Parliament does have that control, but we've got a pretty good deal going with a family which ties to 1,000 years of history, which we timeshare with 15 other countries, and which means that it's exceedingly cost effective for Canada to be part of. And it's allowed a lot more latitude for homegrown institutions and so on. And I think that's not necessarily being appreciated here. Also, just not to, belabor the point a little bit, but the most progressive and stable societies and the most free societies in the world, most of them are constitutional monarchies. And some of the republics, which proclaim freedom and democracy, are in a great deal of trouble these days, and no one more so than our neighbors to the south. And it's strange that we would have anyone who would want to necessarily imitate their particular Republican experiment. So these are all some of the things that I think need to be discussed if we're going to have this conversation around the Republican option. But I don't know that any of these hard conversations are really being thought through. There is this strange sort of sentiment around, well, if we want to be a grown-up country, we can't have a monarchy. Well, there are plenty of grown-up countries that have monarchies, and they work just fine. Our system works pretty well, all things considered. Let's if you want to have this conversation, then let's actually have the conversation, and let's actually think through what it entails, because I don't think that most people actually do have an appreciation for what that all means. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.